All right. Thanks very much for being here, folks. It's a pleasure, one of the real pleasures of my life these days, that I get to give these talks. And the fact that some folks show up to listen in person and others listen later, it just warms an old man's heart. So thank you very much. As usual, we're starting with this great icon created by Jonathan Henderson. And like I've said before, that's one of many icons that he created based on work that he was doing with Nico Bryan and myself. And I hope to share more of these with you soon. In fact, I will be sharing more of these with you soon. Today's talk is about the Dunning Kruger Effect. And it became quite popular to talk about the Dunning Kruger Effect over the last 5 years or so. People started talking about cognitive dissonance and different types of self-deception. And this one is especially interesting to me, and I think it fits nicely into the series of talks that we're still in the early stages of. So the subtitle, I think, reflects how most people see the Dunning-Kruger effect. And it's an important concept that it almost seems as though the more you know about something, the more aware you are that there is more to know. And the less you know about something, the less aware you are that there are depths of expertise you haven't imagined. Now, what's behind this is actually a little bit more complicated than that. And I think exploring it is kind of rewarding. So I'm going to ask you to explore that with me today. Let's start off by considering the ideas that have already been shared in the prior lectures in this series. Like the fact that we think differently at different speeds, and we have 3 different speeds we process information at, and that the first reactions we have to new information shape our opinion of that new information faster than we can consciously think about it, right? Those are things we've already discussed. The fact that it's only through iteratively uncovering behavior that could be improved that we actually learn to improve our behavior. And that same iterative and reflective behavior is what lets us self-calibrate. It's what lets us see whether or not we're behaving the way we want to. In simple, in complex reflex patterns, this is true, like the small muscles in your spine and in your thighs and in your hips and in your feet that are all working together in conjunction with larger muscles in your arms and smaller ones in your neck. They're all working together just to keep you seated upright in a chair. But also the ways that we behave, trying to be the person we want to be, as I discussed a bit last week. The ways that we behave to be who we're proud of. That also comes through this iterative self-reflection. To me, that's really important in times like these, when it would be very easy to give in to that nagging worry, that persistent grief, that anxiety that I talked about in the first of these talks. It'd be very easy to give into that and lower your standards about who you have to be. Let's not do that. Let's self-calibrate and stay who we want to be, so that at the end of all of this, we can look back and believe that while none of us are perfect, and hopefully none of us are striving for that, all of us have remained true to ourselves, remained someone we can be proud to be. So let's talk about all of this a bit more. As I've said many times, the human brain is actually 3 competing processors. And let me describe those competing processors a little bit differently this time. The fastest of those processors is what filters all of the information from the world, whether it's information that you're seeing, processed through your optic nerve, information that you're smelling or touching or hearing. All of the information from the outside world is coming in through this fastest processing system. The next fastest is constantly reacting to or ignoring that information. And whether it does one or the other, that information being processed through the fastest processor is then judged by the next processor. That next processor reacts to it. And as I said before, it reacts very quickly, looking for patterns that it recognizes and patterns that it doesn't. And it is tinged always, because it's in that limbic part of the brain. It is tinged always with strong emotion. And that's really, really important, as we discussed last time. because that means that the rational processor, the part that's hopefully listening to this conversation, the part that we can write with and read with and do math with and even just take logical steps with, that part of the brain starts later than all of the others, and the data it gets has already been emotionally biased emotionally and biased by comparison to pre-assumed models. Kind of complex, right? I promise it gets easier. Let's take a look again. So the first reactions, as I listed there before, showing the funny drawing of the head with all that stuff crammed into it. The first reactions shape our opinion of new information, right? That's just a simple fact. When new information comes, as I said before, we like to think that we take in new information all the time, that we're capable of doing this. I'm always keeping myself informed. But really, what's happening is when that new information comes in, whatever sort it is, we have this visceral reaction to it, this emotional reaction to it, that's going to shape the way we see that. At the same time, we can only learn through uncovering behavior that can be improved. So if we first form new opinions about new information based on information we assume is older because it's been in our head hours or years or microseconds longer, then it's very hard for us to admit that anything we think or do can be improved. It's just sort of against our nature then, because of these two competing levels of information processing. And if self-improvement and self-regulation also comes from that kind of pattern of iteratively trying things out and trying to learn and comparing and maybe deciding you don't need to learn, if that's the case, then these three brains are really getting in the way of our attempts to be who we are and who we want to be. Our attempts to be the best person we can be are being mitigated by the fact that we might have a bias to think that change would be bad, that learning more would be bad. In order to give an explanation of this or an illustration of this, I want to talk to you about our hearing. I don't mean any offense to those of you who are hard of hearing, and probably there should be some version of this where it's written out so that people can read it if they want to. That's not what I'm trying to do here, but I do want to focus on hearing because it's much more complex than most of us realize. And there's some nifty examples about how our brain is fooling us all the time that come from that. Most of us think that our ears are just capturing all of the noise around us all the time, and we are hearing the things and thinking of the things. And some of us think, well, no, we're not really hearing everything because our ears can't hear everything. There's noises that are too deep or too high pitched or on a wavelength we can't perceive with hearing. So, okay, we're not hearing everything, but we're hearing a lot. How do we turn all of the things we're hearing into the things that we're reacting to, the things that we're listening to? How does a jumble of noise become sentences? It's kind of a fun question, and we'll come back to it in a moment. But before we do, I'd like to take another imaginary trip with you. And this one might be one that some of you enjoy more than the imaginary walk in the mountains we took last time. This time, imagine it's 1953, and we're at a cocktail party. Now, this is an imaginary cocktail party from 1953, not a real one. So we can leave the innate classism and racism and sexism of the 1950s out of the picture, and the jingoistic nationalism and all the other things we might not be happy with. And no, this is a cool cocktail party, the kind where we'd all hang out together. And we're at this cocktail party in 1953. Actually, let's make one more change. Don't imagine you're at a cocktail party in 1953. Imagine that you're a cherry at a cocktail party in 1953. And that's a really bad dad joke, as promised in the advertisements. There was a researcher, a social psychologist, a neuropsychologist from England called Colin Sherry, who published a paper in 1953 about what he called the cocktail party problem. And the cocktail party problem, maybe some of you have heard of it before. It's not running out of mix. The cocktail party problem is the fact that we can, in a crowd with all kinds of noise all around us, discern the streams of language we want to pay attention to and pay attention to them. So you can stand facing a friend or a stranger, if you're lucky. Stand facing a stranger and listen to what they're saying, despite the fact that other people all around you are talking at the same volume, and some of them are speaking even more loudly. This is called dichotic listening. At least that's the name that Dr. Cherry gave it. Dichotic listening means to be able to switch your attention back and forth. And after Dr. Cherry published about this in '53, a lot of other people followed up with interesting publications. His first follow-up was about how in the stream of all of the noise, you can be sure to focus on one person. But more than that, if you're focused on the one person and ignoring all of the other noise, and all of a sudden someone you care about walks into the room, you will hear them speak, even though you are focusing on this noise and ignoring all the others. An interesting, simple follow-up to that was the fact that if somebody says your name, even a stranger, if they pronounce your name, you'll hear that, and that will come through the noise that you are filtering out. So dichotic listening is really quite complex, a little more complex than the name implies, starting with di. So this is the idea that there are some people speaking and there are other people speaking, and you can focus on these folks, right? Or on these folks. And you can go back and forth and you can change what you're listening to. And this seems obvious. Yeah, we all do that. But how does it happen? So there was this fantastic bit of research a couple of decades ago where somebody had an unusual opportunity, as we call it in the research community. There were patients being prepared for brain surgery, so their brains were exposed. And this researcher, I'm not going to get the name right now, so I'm not going to try it. I'll add it to the notes wherever this video is posted. This researcher looked at which parts of the brain were operating while someone was asked, yes, they were conscious, was asked to focus on one of two video screens. Focus on these folks, now on these folks. And what they found was that the part of the brain that reacts to noises was reacting. And at the same time, the part of the brain that reacts to language was reacting. And in both cases, they got reaction patterns going on. They got reaction patterns going on. They got reaction patterns going on simultaneously. And the reaction to people being paid attention to, the noise patterns of people who they were paying attention to matched the patterns of reaction in the part of the brain that processes language. And the noise patterns in the people they weren't paying attention to matched the reactions in the part of the brain that processed noise. And all they had to do was say to the person sitting there with their brain exposed and electrodes hooked up and two video screens in front of them, all they had to do was say, now switch which one you're paying attention to. And pay attention there, listen to the words. Okay, now pay attention to this one. And by going back and forth, they could show that there was some filtering process in the brain that was happening. Some filtering process where all of the noise streaming in was being filtered. But there's more than that going on. Of course there is. The other thing that's going on is that the filtered information is then reconstructed into richer information. And that seems ridiculous. I alluded to it a bit last week, and it seems ridiculous. But it's true. If you've ever been singing along to the radio in your car, if people still have radios and if people still have cars, if you've ever been singing along to the radio in your car and then you stop focusing so much on the street, or the noise gets a little less, and suddenly you can hear where you are in the song. Have you ever noticed that sometimes you're singing the wrong part of the song? And I don't mean because you didn't remember the words. That's a common issue, sure. But what I mean is that very often we're hearing part and reconstructing the rest because our hearing is imperfect. And hilariously, that works not only with our hearing, but also with our vision and with most of our other sensory information. We take in partial information and we reconstruct according to the model that we currently have in place. And yeah, it's how much it happens with vision, about 80% of the time, is shocking, but we'll get into that in some other talk. What I want you to take away from this for now is the idea that everything you hear is based on what you're expecting to hear. Maybe what you're scared of hearing, where you hear, was that the baby? When it wasn't. Or maybe what you were hoping to hear. Or mostly it's just what you expected to hear because of the situation you're in, where you're nodding along, and you all can think of many examples where you're nodding along to someone and only hearing some of what they're saying, but you're certain you're hearing everything that they're saying. And when you think of that, maybe you can relate it to some other experiences you've had at home or at work. But knowing it is kind of weird, isn't it? Actually knowing that that's how hearing works, that we're reconstructing the hearing to match the patterns that we already expect it to follow, so that the words become words we're expecting to hear. What that means when you think about what I just talked about a minute ago, about the biases we form, what that means is that when you're trying to explain something to someone, they're listening to your words and fitting them into a pattern of information that they already are biased to reject, because it doesn't match what they already know and believe. Sort of puts a whole new light on trying to teach yourself or someone else anything. It's not because they're rude. It's just because that's how our brains work. So how do you convince someone of something new? Well, there's a few ways to do that. If they have some kind of reward built in, and no, I don't mean offering them cookies, though certainly when it becomes physically possible, I would love it if someone were to offer me a cookie again someday. What I mean is, if there is some buy-in that says, I was clever enough to be part of this group, I am clever enough, I am lucky enough, I am smart enough, I am unique enough to be part of this group. So the advances in information that come from this group are part of my information. So I can embrace that, things like that. Or if you're capable of saying, this person now who's talking, that person, oh, everything they say is true, right? In some cases, that's wonderful for quickly getting new information in. In other cases, it's horrible.
I think you cut out again, John.
Was I out 6 or 7 hours?
Just a few seconds.
Okay. So I hope it was when I was making a funny face at the camera. So information that you get from a source that's just unchallengeable is really hard to overcome again later using the same processes I was just talking about. So this might seem like the perfect time to introduce the scientific method, which I've alluded to a couple of times already in these talks, the greatest invention in human history. It might, but maybe it wouldn't be the perfect time. Ooh, the doubt. Yeah, this time let's talk about certainty instead. Let's stick to that. So to sum up what I've been trying to say, for those of you who couldn't hear me while I was frozen, a natural consequence of the way that we attach value to things we already know compared to the things that we are learning new gives us a certain pride of possession, if you want to call it that, that makes it really hard for us to overcome the barrier between what we believe we know and what we might be able to learn. And that includes learning new skills, that includes learning from world experience, and that includes trusting anybody else's opinion. Now, as I referred to a couple of times in these talks already, these kinds of cognitive weaknesses have been strengths at some time in the past. It probably made it possible for those proto-prosimian great-grandparents I talked about last time to leave their nests in the trees and eventually wander out into tall grass. false confidence, overconfidence work that way. Sometimes it's not so evolutionarily advantageous, or at least sometimes what is evolutionarily advantageous for society as a whole isn't very good for individuals in society who are stuck making bad decisions, or whose close relatives and neighbors made bad decisions. Now, when we look at that kind of behavior, it's natural to think, how on earth could anyone be arrogant enough to think, I, with what I know more than an expert in this field, right? It comes back to these biases I was talking about. The information we have is obviously more valuable than the information someone else has. But really, to the point where we'd say, I know more than an expert virologist. Really? It seems strange that it could possibly happen that way. And I refer you to a very short one-page article in Newsweek in January 20th or 21st, whichever one was the day Newsweek came out in 1980. I think it was January 20th, but I could be wrong, by the great Isaac Asimov. The headline was A Cult of Ignorance. And in it, he describes the fact that anti-intellectualism had created an environment in the US by that point. Anti-intellectualism had created an environment in the US where a lot of people associated the idea of democracy with the idea that an ignorant opinion is every bit as valuable as an informed opinion. I'm sorry to say, it seems to have gotten worse. But his notion was that this was deliberate, that there was an attempt to misinform people, to undereducate people, so that this idea could spread, that not knowing something didn't mean that you should be any quieter when someone who knows something is trying to save the day, stop a plane from crashing, stop a virus from spreading, things like that. And you might be thinking, but like that makes sense for opinions, right? Democratically, we're all entitled to our opinions, right? But expert knowledge? Like opinions, sure, we all have different opinions about all kinds of things. And it makes sense. We should have different opinions. That there's nothing wrong with that. Well, sometimes there's something wrong with that, but having different opinions is one thing, but having differing beliefs in expert knowledge in a dismissive way, that's a totally different thing. That's treating expertise as though it's only an opinion. And treating expertise like it's only an opinion is a very dangerous thing. Now, again, I'm going to come back to this idea again in future talks and talk about some of the other mechanics behind this, but I just wanted to stress that. And I'm going to give you what I hope is kind of a fun example about the difference between opinion and expertise.
Lost you again, John.
He robbed 2 banks consecutively in broad daylight, not covering his face, not wearing a mask. He was captured fully on the bank security cameras, and his photo was shared with the press, who put it on television. And later that evening, the police came to his place and arrested him. And apocryphally, as they were arresting him, he was shouting, "But I wore the juice, but I wore the juice." During the processing interviews, he explained that he knew he was invisible to the cameras because he had put lemon juice on his face. And lemon juice is the same as invisible ink. So clearly it would make his face invisible to the cameras. It's an interesting opinion. And you might say, but he had no expert facts to back that up. Well, he thought he did. He had taken a picture of himself with putting lemon juice on his face. He took a picture of himself and he saw that his face was blanked out. Now, was that because he had lemon juice in his eyes? or on the lens? I don't know. He did say later on that it was especially hard to rob the banks because he had lemon juice stinging his eyes while he was doing it. That story, you can look it up with Snopes.com, or you can look it up in whatever your favorite press source is, or just Google it. But it's also featured in this paper, Unskilled and Unaware of It, how difficulties in recognizing one's own incompetence lead to inflated self-assessment, by David Dunning and Justin Kruger. And Professors Dunning and Kruger wrote this paper basically just discussing his case. And as you can imagine, that's where the name, the Dunning Kruger Effect, comes from. And it's come to mean a lot more than just one guy rubbed lemon juice on his face. A lot more than one guy's inexpert opinion was shockingly and dramatically proven to be wrong. Some people call this illusory superiority and talk about how this is the observed fact that the more ignorant you are about something, the less you think there is to know about it. And the more likely you are to think that you're probably good at it. Another term used in academia is the anosognosia of daily life, which, wow, what a great word, right? Anosognosia, man. People get paid to come up with words like that. I just want to take a minute and teach you the word. Not to be pedantic, no, though certainly that is one of the things in my wheelhouse, but there's a purpose to this. A meaning not, and nosos meaning disease, and gnosis meaning knowledge. Not disease, knowledge. It's actually a term that originally comes from 1914. It's a neuropsychological disorder that actually involves physical damage to the parietal lobe, where someone who's diagnosed with this is physiologically, neurologically incapable of understanding that they have a disease. It's been generalized a bit since then to mean the way that all of us are very bad at diagnosing ourselves, knowing our own limitations. So nosos gnosis, anosognosia, anosognosia. And learning that word changes how you can understand that word. Now, instead of just being a big number of weirdly spaced letters, and let's just go back, those are kind of weirdly spaced letters. Come on, osogna, osogno, that's just weird, right? But having it broken down into its root components makes it easier to understand. And that's what we did with this graph. You remember these curves, of course you do. They're ingrained in our cultural understanding right now, but ingrained incorrectly. And that's why a couple of weeks ago, we looked at these and I provided additional contextual information, right? That was really an important thing to do. Whoops. I provided additional contextual information that would help you understand those at a different level. Now, let's not look at this curve right now. Let's go on to this other curve. There we are. This is the curve of the Dunning Kruger effect. And you see that confidence starts out low, immediately becomes very high with no experience at all, almost. And then as soon as you start getting experience, confidence nosedives again, right? Before slowly climbing up and leveling out somewhere much lower than that initial inexperienced confidence. Let's break that down a bit. So here you can see someone has gone from first hearing about something, it's possible to juggle cats, to thinking, yeah, I could probably juggle cats. And then they've tried it. And when they've tried it, the very first bit of real world experience at juggling cats has taught them that, yeah, you know, sorry, I'm acting very badly. That's a very poor impersonation. I should be covered in bandages and blood. I cannot juggle cats is what they've very quickly learned. And then this next area is the process of actually learning how to juggle cats, which I can't quite imagine, though if you want to imagine it, Steve Martin did a great video documentary about it some time ago, about illegal cat juggling. It's a very, very insightful and powerful documentary. Anyhow, this change from false confidence to sudden recognition of one's own limitations to the gradual ability to build up through experience some degree of confidence in one's ability. This describes a single skill, not your life. Though personally, I think that probably the curve goes a bit more like this, because even once you've gotten to a point where you feel pretty stable in your knowledge, it's always possible you're going to learn new parameters and have little ups and downs. You feel, oh, hey, I can do, oh, wait, no, crap, oh, hey, but I bet I could improve it like this. No, nope, that didn't improve it, and things like that. So as I was saying, that change in understanding takes you from, oh yeah, I know that graph. I've seen that graph a million times. I know the curves, everybody knows the curves. By adding some context to 2 weeks ago about what the curves actually mean, about what exponential means versus linear, about what that limit in the middle actually means. It's not the number of hospital beds, it's the number of available beds for 2 to 3 week periods involving 24-hour care and life support equipment, right? It's automatically knowing that changed everything. And then last week I brought those graphs up again because I wanted to look at the curves with you in terms of how our brains work, right? Changing again the context with which we were looking at those curves. Now, using it to think about this idea of how your knowledge of those graphs has changed. Let's use that to think about how we learn things, how we develop some expertise through experience, how we develop some fundamental skills even through experience. And further research by the folks behind Dunning Kruger and by others makes it really clear that practical, hands-on cognitive training inhibits the decay effect. It's possible for somebody who is absolutely overconfident about their ability with crosswords to become capable of doing crosswords and to become self-calibrated in their understanding of their own ability to do crosswords simply by doing them. And it's the same with everything else. People who think they're good drivers, if they're put through meticulous, controlled driver training, quickly realize that they're not, and usually can become better drivers. The pitch for today is that this does work for others, like in the situations I've just described, but it also works for ourselves, provided we let it. If we are open to exposing ourselves to controlled and measured training, we can give up our illusion of superiority, learn where we really stand, and then learn how to change that if we want to. It's uncertainty that makes that possible. It's the admission of uncertainty, the admission that others know more, that the world knows more, that there is more to learn than what I currently hold. But if it is uncertainty that makes it possible to learn, then certainty
The audio cut out again.
just trying to say that certainty of anything will get in the way of your ability to learn that thing. And that's regardless of whether it's about individual or group skills, whether it's about the world or other people, or whether it's about ourselves. The more certain you are about any of those things, the harder it will be for you to learn. And you won't be able to learn more until you set aside your certainty. So if you'd like to do that some more, set aside some certainty. Learn to use the different parts of your brain to improve your ability to learn new things and to self-calibrate. And I encourage you to do that. And if there's any way that I can help, I hope you'll let me know. Thanks very much for listening. I'm going to leave you here for a moment with this ridiculously long quote from my first book, just because it talks about this a bit, and I kind of think it's nice writing. Anyhow, it's been a pleasure. I'm going to stop sharing the screen in a moment. The presentation and this video will be available publicly soon. Thank you. There we go. Okay, folks, if you'd like to chat, please feel free to turn on your microphones and or videos. Jupiter, I think maybe this would be a good time to stop the recording so that people's privacy is respected. Anybody have any questions, comments, or Rotten Tomatoes?
Well, thanks very much, John.
You're welcome, Julian. Uh-oh, did I cut out again?
No, you're good.
Oh, okay. Does anyone else have any questions or comments? Anything they'd like to say? Portions they'd like repeated because the frozen video stopped them from seeing or hearing it? No? Okay.
I had no idea how that curve that you saw is the exact curve that Gartner uses for their hype curve.
Yeah, a lot of people use it in different ways. My associates in Europe and I are mapping it to the Johari window to show how learning progresses in a deeper way, individually and in groups, so that we can talk about how AIs can cooperate, hopefully in the near future.
Yeah, it's a powerful curve, and it really mirrors a lot of people's reactions to things. I always use the example of like when the iPhone came out and how you get so excited and then it's kind of a letdown and then it normalizes, and it is a very interesting cycle.
It is. I guess a big part of marketing, and I could be entirely wrong here, it wouldn't be the first time today, but I guess a big part of marketing is trying to slow the plummet after the initial hype.
Yep. Well, it's interesting when you take the hype curve and then you take Jeffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm and you actually overlay those two things, because it informs the various audiences and their various psychological state, and then what marketing needs to deliver against that. Oh, you cut out. I can't hear you.
Oh no, not again. Well, I was just praising John for his insight. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep,
I can hear you. Yep.
Okay, great. I was just praising John Tremblay for his insight and saying that I'd like to talk about that with you sometime, John, when talking in person over coffee or beer is possible again.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Cheers. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to raise or knock down?
I'm sorry I missed you. I just got the last slide, so I'm going to watch the recap.
Okay. I think those will be available soon. We have to, John and I have to chat about when that's going to happen and how that's going to happen.
Okay. Well, I look forward to the opportunity.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you so much for doing this, John. I really appreciate you sharing your wisdom with the team.
Well, you're very kind. I appreciate it. I'm a little embarrassed when you phrase it like that, but it's certainly something that entertains me and pleases me. So I feel very rewarded for it.
So, John, to go back to, I don't know, towards the end when you were talking about how we can avoid succumbing to the Dunning Kruger effect in ourselves, it seemed like the important thing was to sort of lean in to uncertainty and, question yourself if you feel certain about something.
100%, Corey.
So that's okay, cool.
Yeah, the more certainty you have, literally the less capable you are of learning. And it's not because of choices you're making, it's because of unconscious choices being made by the part of your brain that wouldn't respond to logic if it had to.
Certainty is in some way the enemy of learning.
Yes, exactly. It's a strange thing. And I'm often accused of being very certain because of the way I speak. And I think it's just a confusion between certainty and deliberateness or deliberation. I try to be deliberate in the way I speak, and I have very strong opinions that I express when I do that. But there's a reason I said that I could be wrong and it wouldn't be the first time today. I can prove mathematically that I'm wrong about everything all the time, because the body of knowledge in the world is so much greater than anything I could possibly be right about. So I think that's part of training as a scientist. Contrary to what most people think, you're taught to doubt yourself all the time and to only trust your ideas once they've been validated by a bunch of other peers, and to give up your ideas the moment they're disproven.
Yeah, it takes it takes a lot of humility to consciously move around the world with that model, and be upfront about like, hey, I could be wrong, and even as I'm an expert in the field, or I think I'm an expert and I'm saying these things, but demonstrate your willingness to learn and adapt by changing your beliefs as new and better peer-reviewed information is available.
Cheers. Yeah, I think it's hard conscious work to be like that, and I don't think I succeed as much as I'd like to, but it's certainly something that I try to do all the time, and I would encourage everyone to try to do. I miss you, Corey. It's been too long.
Miss you too, buddy.
Thanks. Anybody else? Any questions or comments? I don't have to be the middle of it either. We can all just talk to each other if you want to turn your cameras on. And your microphones. That would probably help more than cameras. No? Okay, then I guess maybe we'll wrap this up and give it 5 seconds of silence to see if anything changes.
Thanks very much, John.
Thank you, John. Take care, all. Have a
Thanks,
great
John.
day.